have Sheila Marie, that you know. Sheila has been a chair of our association for a couple of terms, and she helped to bring here the International Club of Rome in 2013, and we put on the international conference here. But Sheila has continued to work behind the lines and helping, being our liaison with the international group, and she also started the North and South American communication. So we've had a number of meetings here in Ottawa connecting the association from the States, from Latin American countries, and KCOR. And so she's been instrumental in organizing all that and keeps in touch with them by phone, I think, on a weekly basis. So we really have the best information coming from Sheila. And the next one, who's going to take up most of the time talking to us about this emergency plan, is Ted. And Ted, you know very well as well, because Ted has made a number of presentations to us. And he has been involved mostly with tourism and sustainable tourism, but his capacity goes far beyond that, and he's helped KCOR in many ways by coming up with our strategic plan. He's a great researcher when it comes when we have something, somebody says, oh, can you look into trying to get more university students, or how can we help university students? Ted came up with the research, the study. I mean, he really does an awful lot of work for KCOR. He was also a chair of KCOR, and he's been with us since about the 1970s, so that's quite a bit of dedication. Thank you, Joshua. So now I'll ask Sheila to start.
Okay. Well, thanks again. It's great to be among KCOR friends. And I was trying to remember when I first joined KCOR, and it doesn't matter much, but it certainly has changed a great deal. And not that there was anything wrong with the beginning experience, but now it's really a friendly group and a welcoming group. If you can see that I'm favoring this arm, it's because it's been twisted by Madeline and Ted. No, actually, I had a shingles vaccination. But nevertheless, I think it's most timely that we have Ted talking about adaptation, and as a preface to his presentation, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the documents that I think are really important for us as members of KCOR and as citizens of Canada, because we have roles to play and we must play them. We're further along the disaster scale, I think, than anyone wants to admit. And Jennifer's comments about the weather. I mean, we have January weather in November, and we did last year too. So things are beginning to change, I think, quite rapidly. Anyways, with that in mind, I wanted to make reference to the World Wide Fund for Nature. It used to be the World Wildlife Fund, and it produced a document, Living Beyond Nature's Limits, in 10th of May, 2019. And unfortunately, I didn't make copies for the table, but I'm hoping at some point, Art, that we could make sure we have access to this document. It's called the EU Overshoot Day, Living Beyond Nature's Limits, 10th of May, 2019. And we need now about 2.8 planets in order to satisfy our wants and possibly requirements. So that's an important document which feeds into the Planetary Emergency Plan published by the Club of Rome. The second document is a document called the Stockholm Resilience Center Report. This was a report made by Johan Rockström, from the center at the University of Stockholm, which published this document. He presented it to the Club of Rome AGM a year ago. This is an important report. It's very positive. Transformation is feasible. And Johan, I want to give a little bit of information about him. He was here for the 2013 AGM and meeting we hosted for the International Club of Rome. And I spent about an hour talking with him because he wanted to know about the Club of Rome. And at that point, I was on the executive of the club. So he is a self-made man. He is a scholar, but he founded a bank in Sweden. When he decided he'd made enough money, he sold it, and he's devoted to making sure that we don't perish, and there will be several generations beyond us. Johan is now the head of the Potsdam Institute in Berlin. The founder just recently retired. So he has a big finger on the planetary emergency plan. And here it is. I'm sorry you don't have it in living color, but you can download it, I think, Art.
I'll make it downloadable.
Will you? Okay, thanks very much. Anyways, I need my glasses for the fine print here. Planetary Emergency Plan Securing a New Deal for People, Nature, and Climate. Published by the Club of Rome in May, I believe, or just, it's about that time I think it came out, in partnership with the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. So back to Johan Rostrom. He is really a dedicated person dedicated to our survival. You have copies of that, not in full color. Full color costs a lot. So it's in black and white, and thanks to Art's ingenuity and expertise, you should be able to download this plan. So these are documents that you have on the table. I'm not going to read from them. I like to call myself an adult educator, and you never read to audiences. But there are 10 commitments for our global commons, and in 2013, that was our theme, is governance of the commons. That is the air, the soil, and the water. And one can't be dealt with without dealing with the other two. That is the holistic nature of our planet. Then the second part in this, it's so important, 10 urgent actions for the transformation. In other words, for our survival. So Dan is going to deal with this. So those are some of the background documents that I think are so important. You also have the Sydney Morning Herald, an article. And the reason you have it is because Ian Dunlop is the author. Ian was here for the meeting in 2013. He's an Australian by birth. You can look in the second page. He was an international oil, gas, and coal industry executive and chair of the Australian Coal Association and the Australian Institute of Company Directors. He suddenly saw what he was doing, or the work he was doing, what the impact was. And he has published a great deal. He's the guy behind the International Club of Rome who has insisted that some of these documents be created and then circulated. So I thought you'd find this interesting. As you may know, I tend to ask questions at Club of Rome meetings about what are we doing where we live, because we do not live in the constructs that we've created, which are called regions, provinces, countries. We live and we can act where we live to make things better and to help people understand what's happening. The last document is one from the Globe and Mail on Saturday, and KLM published Fly Responsibly, a full-page publication, and I think and I hope that there will be a move towards other large international corporations to start talking about what it means. And I'll read one part. We invite the aviation industry to join us in making the world aware of our shared responsibility. We value competition, but we must work together to make the aviation industry sustainable. That is why we commit to sharing what we have learned with you, open our best practices. Feel free to make use of our certified carbon offset program. We also invite all corporations to join a corporate biofuel program, ours or any other. And we invite air travelers to fly responsibly. So maybe that's something that we can look forward to. And now, over to Ted, who has done so much work in the Club of Rome internationally and here. And as I recall, 6 years ago maybe, at the Club of Rome, Ted made a presentation, and it was entitled Risk Management. And I remember some of the people, my colleagues and his colleagues at the club said, "What is this? Is this the insurance industry? What's he selling?" But Ted had made the leap, because if it's too late for mitigation, adaptation, and some of the other words that we use, perhaps we should focus on managing the risks. And that requires knowing what they are, where we live, and what each of us can do about it. Over to you.
Okay, Sheila. How many of you believe we're going to fix this at the global level? Put up your hand. Think so? Maybe. Okay. Well, most people are a little worried these days about that actually happening. And that really is why we are looking at adaptation. And I've got a little bit here, and thanks to John Hollins for some input that made it very useful. Is that okay? Adaptation is what we want to talk about. And the reason we want to do that is that there is really no guarantee that we are going to solve the problem without having some risk to ourselves, to our communities, to our children. We've got to have adaptation plans in place. We're going to have a brief look at risk management and adaptation, the particular vulnerability of small island sites, risk and the need to deal in the industry I work in most, the tourist industry, who has almost all of its assets right where the nasty climate hits the road, the coastal zone. And I'll end just with a brief discussion, which we did for the folks in New York a month or so ago, on the adaptation manual that many of you have helped produce. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce says Canada's not ready for climate change. It needs clear federal policy. It needs carbon regulation and a climate adaptation strategy. Now, those are real people. And the nice thing about climate adaptation is it tends to be real, local, and something you or your friends can do. Unlike so many of the other strategies which involve mass political mobilization of everyone to try and get them together, mitigation is a difficult thing to do. Adaptation can be done in chunks, and it usually benefits the people who try to do it. And I'll thank John Hollins for finding these, If all the pledges are implemented, the world has a 50% chance of staying under 2.7 degrees and a 66% chance of staying under 3 degrees. And there are consequences of this. Sea level rise, health issues, drought in the tropics, ecosystem changes, permafrost going away, reduced glacier cover, lower Great Lakes. There's a need to prepare for a not impossible set of changes where you get things like an entire reservoir disappearing and you're stuck in Las Vegas drinking just booze because there's no water. Some of the things that are happening now, and we don't have to extrapolate them much, are things like large-scale erosions of cliffs in California. Grenada being hit for the first time with major catastrophic hurricanes. Flooding in Senegal. And in Sri Lanka, a lot of boats washed up on shore. All of these mean that somebody locally has to cope and try and put up with this, either to anticipate and prevent or to at least run with it. Some other issues. Snow in Cyprus. Sandstorms in Egypt. Heavy forest fires in Greece. You can't say those are not climate change related, and any change in the global regimes has its local implications. So if you own this hotel in Thessalonica, what do you want to do? You're going to cut some trees, you're going to have decent fire. I tried to use the swimming pool, but they drained it for water to try and get rid of the forest fires coming really close. The fact is that you got to do little things locally. You got to try and be there prepared to deal with crises like these. Other kinds of crises we often talk about. This is actually tsunami results. And when Margot and I went to Thailand to help them deal with it in the tourism industry, what happened was they didn't know what they could do. It was unprepared. Something just happened. And they now have a wonderful strategy for that beach, which probably makes it the safest one in the world, the one where all the people died, because they have buoys floating 5 to 10 kilometers offshore. They have a siren system. They have built raised platforms. And they will announce to people if there's any chance to get off the beach, get to those platforms, and you can watch the storm surge or the tsunami or the hurricane from there. That is adaptation. And that, in fact, is what's keeping them back in business, because they can now assure you that they're probably the safest beach in the world. So adaptation strategies include a number of different things. Hazard assessment, robust planning based on your understanding of the hazards, site and project design, where you don't build your big tower right on the beach so that the first big storm surge is going to take your foundations out. And boy, it almost hit Mar-a-Lago only a couple of months ago. There is no justice. Risk management. The thing is that if you can identify the risks, you can begin to do it. And that can be really simple. You just don't put your restaurant on the first floor, and therefore there's nobody there, or you don't have to rush everybody out. Your restaurant's on the second floor, has a better view, and if you've designed it right, the storm surge just passes by. You also have to have recovery plans. Many of the places we work with in the tourism industry have plans in place to figure how on earth they're going to bring it back if it does, worst case, have a terrorist attack, but also if you get a hurricane or if you get a major dislocation. How are you going to build it back? Relocation is a big one. We've been looking at villages, looking at whether they have to relocate themselves. I'll give you an example or two in a minute. And, of course, insurance. And people said, you're going to just shill for the insurance industry. I'm sorry. The insurance industry is, in fact, the best ally we have. They're the one who's going to come just to you and say, I'm going to hit you right in the wallet. If you insist on doing something stupid right there, A, you can't get insurance, or B, you're going to pay me so much that you can't afford it. And therefore it becomes much more intelligent as feedback to go and do something that makes sense. You don't build your no hotel right on top of the eroding beaches. You build it back farther. You build it differently. You use construction types of approaches that actually allow you to either be robust enough to survive or at least to mitigate the negative things and allow yourself to build back. People insist on building back everywhere. That is the real problem. And these guys in Galveston, if you've gone along the dunes in Galveston, everybody is up on stilts. And some of them are not up on big enough stilts. But the idea is that when the hurricane surge comes through, everything you own that's worth having is 2 stories up. And the stuff lower down is where you keep the stuff you don't really care much about. Sometimes things are pretty local. This is in the Gambia. You want to try and get to that toilet? Sometimes local structures are really nailed when things change, when floods happen. And where do you want to build your hotel or your lovely thing on this coast? This is Portuguese coast. You do not build close. Even though it is a pretty rock coast, it's not a stable rock coast. And in fact, places that do understand adaptation strategies will simply put buffers in to say you just can't build there. They're not even going to put out a viewpoint that's out on there because you might disappear when it does. This is an eco-resort in the Gambia. Now, what's different about that? They all float. They have no ability to understand what's happening with the river. Sometimes it can be a lot higher, sometimes a lot lower. But that doesn't matter because it's a wonderful adaptation strategy. All of the utilities are in pipes that go up, allow it to go up and down. There's a neat one on Fire Island where somebody built their cottage on the beach, an old caboose on rails. And whenever a storm was going to come, they simply jack it up the hill. And once the storm's by, they let her down again. And that's an adaptation strategy. This is in Curacao. They had originally stone berms, but now they've had to make it bigger, and they're already under construction to make larger ones, to make sure that the larger storm surges that are anticipated, associated with potential climate change, are mitigated in advance. Okay. One of the areas we've done a lot of work on lately is small island development states. And a couple of the others of you are better at this than me. They are at the lead in adaptation by necessity. Many of them have no high points. Many of them, quite frankly, what they do is virtually immaterial relative to mitigation because they're producing so little, and yet they are the recipient of the costs. Work by UNEP has identified specific strategies for SIDS, for small island developing states. And some of this involves pre-positioning, creating raised shelters, fortifying infrastructure, creating storage of emergency materials, because it's very hard to get there, as we saw in Bahamas last summer. Very hard to get there with stuff. It has to be brought in. Many of the smaller countries have not done reasonable initial assessments, and that was a requirement under climate change some years ago. Or if they've done them, they haven't upgraded them, and that is really a particular look at vulnerability. The map to the right shows you the path of every hurricane since 27, and they show. That's a lot of hurricanes. It doesn't say which ones are big or small, but those are the actual paths. So if you happen to live in the black part, you might want to think about being prepared. And that's what an adaptation strategy is. And we know under climate change that we know less and less. We don't know how big or where they are changing. Even if we use that map as a prediction, it tells us anything, because the parameters have changed. And the next one could go farther north, farther south, farther in, or whatever. As I say, Grand Bahamas 2019 is the poster child, because it's the first time they got a direct hit of a force 5 or higher, And essentially all of the preparation they'd done, and it was very good, was not enough. This place is the Maldives, and each of those islands is not much bigger than a couple of football fields. We were working there building 2-story mosques on the island, because most of the islands have low structures, many of them built as grass huts. People pay a fortune to go there to live in a beautiful grass hut at $3,000 a night. So they have the money, and we got them to accept 2-story mosques, because normally foreigners are not allowed in the mosque. But the deal was, we'll help them build it if you fortify the 2nd story and you allow the tourists into the mosque if there is a storm surge or a tsunami. This one was hit by tsunami as well. And they've also done those berms, ugly berms off the thing that they've had to do just to deal with storm surge. They have a monument in the Maldives to the structures that they're using to protect the capital. And there are about 500,000 of those to make a large berm around the whole of island of Malé. And the design is to essentially, again, intercept storm surges and to redirect them. And there's a big argument there right now of how high they will have to be, because, again, they cannot predict, they don't have the data, and the parameters are all changing. That's one way to do the structures. The other one, we're looking at many of the areas is how you can plant new species, because if the climate is changing, you don't want to hit something that is on the extreme limit of its own adaptability. And so you're planting for hopefully 30 to 50 years in advance, although in the tropics it's a shorter growth period. And the idea is to not put your permanent structures in low coastal plain sites. And that's nice to say, but many of these small islands don't have anything that isn't a close. It is really a problem. So you can get a situation like Tuvalu. Now about 10,000 people live there. That's all of it. It's the entire country. Highest point in it is about a yard above sea level. And the population has been prolific and already outstripped its own water supply. So it imports water from other places nearby. They haven't yet got enough money to build a desalination plant. The interesting strategy they have for adaptation is to make sure half the male population isn't there almost all the time. What they did was they built a mariner school, and they trained the male population to be mariners, and they're away on ships a lot of the time. Or they're away on Nauru mining on a different island. So a significant part of the male population is abroad at any point in time. They also are looking now to buy a brand new island, and Fiji's talking to them about doing that, because their projections, even on fairly good best case scenarios, show that it's not very likely that that island will be there in 30 years' time. And it's debatable as to whether they're going to become Fijians or lease the island as a country. Let's do something else. San Blas Islands, on the other hand, in the Caribbean, similar situation, tiny little islands, part of Panama. And the problem is, they are paradise. They have no problem getting tourists. They have no, but you get the slightest. Right now, they are outside of the hurricane path. They've only had one hurricane in about 50 years. At the time when they did it, there were probably 200 people living on the islands. Now there's about 2,000. And their whole plan right now is supposedly that they immediately get them all on boats and run them to the nearest higher land. But that's it. But that is an adaptation strategy. Longer term, perhaps you try and relocate some of those villages. Okay, finally, the tourism sector. All of its buildings are in fragile areas, most of them coastal. The planning of new facilities now depends on country. In Germany, you've got a central climate factor built into everything. It's part of the planning procedure. It's now the world's largest industry. It's building more real estate than almost anybody else. And many countries are saying we've got to have climate change risk built in. At least Germany is, and Spain is, and a few others. But the people who are demanding that planning are the people who will loan them money, the banks, and the people who will insure them, the insurance companies. And they are the ones who are pushing other countries to demand that kind of thing. We've been working for a while with the Caribbean, specifically with Caribbean Development Bank and with a number of islands for a sustainable tourism zone of the Caribbean that are going to try and develop standards that will be shared amongst all of them. And the deal, well, if I try and tell you you have to have higher standards on Grenada, you say, well, I'll go to St. Vincent. And if St. Vincent says, I want higher standards and we want you to do this, they'll move to Jamaica. Not anymore. They are now looking together to get shared standards that can be mutually enforced. And not there yet, but we think it may work. There's also a lot of renovation of infrastructure. Take the fragile stuff off the beach, get escape routes, mark like they do in the U.S. the escape routes, and make sure that you have a decent system that actually notifies everyone when something's likely to happen. How's my time doing? Okay. Right. Also, essentially, move the tourists away from storms. That means that in some beaches actually have a total mobility plan, which will take everybody and take them up, if there is an up, or take them inland if they have to. They do some of that in some of the Florida islands. Cruise ships are a solution. Now, what's interesting is Cozumel. How many of you have been to Cozumel? You're there? Yeah. There's not very many hotels on Cozumel, but there are lots of cruise ships. And the day the storm hits, where are the cruise ships? They're in Miami, or they're in Honduras. And that is an adaptation strategy, where essentially you don't build fixed infrastructure, you build mobile infrastructure. And therefore it goes away from the risks. And if you can predict the risks, and they're pretty good at that now, you get them where people are not harmed. Even if it means that your lovely Caribbean cruise ends up in Halifax, it's better than being dead. Other places don't have the mobility. That's Venice. And did you see the news today? Venice, there was only about a foot of water in the plaza when I was there. And today I think it's 2 or 3. And even the raised walkways that take you around through it that they have prepared for are not high enough. And so really they're having a problem. And even another major adaptation thing they tried, massive floodgates on the lagoon, were insufficient. Why? Because a rainfall event put the water behind the floodgates, and they had high tides at the same time, and they couldn't open them to drain it. So even the best plans of Venetians seem to often be insufficient, although they do have floating wharves. The floating wharves mean they have a decent transport system everywhere, even when it's high or low. You can still get on and off easily the islands. Nice level platforms, just step on and off because the boats and the wharves float at the same time. Emergency preparedness. That really is just prepositioning things, making sure you have the equipment in place, storage and stockpiling of essentials. And in fact, there's really a procurement issue with many of the UN agencies as to how much they can afford to preposition and where, and whether they have sufficient communication capacity to move it. As often if you're in an island that's or a remote coast, it can be days before you can even get the equipment there to take the stuff, even if it's in the same region. The whole notion is that dealing in the tourism industry, you pre-plan for the whole thing. You're not. You're going to also use the industry's own capacity to get the locals out as well, or to make sure that they are part of the same solution. And the emergency shelter, the hurricane shelter, doesn't matter who you are, you can come in. So it's not any given set. And the biggest issue for many countries is just capacity building. Is there somebody there to run it? The day you have a panic, who do you call? when the tsunami hit, and this is not a storm-related one, but it's not. It is the tsunami is an example. It hit on Boxing Day, on 2008, I think it was, 2005, and nobody was killed in Kenya when it came ashore, and that was just serendipity, because somebody had called ahead, and on Boxing Day, the head of one section of the tourism thing happened to be at their desk in Nairobi. And they immediately just mobilized the entire network, and every single hotel on the coast went and told everybody to get off the beach and phoned all their friends, and it was a marvelous network. And therefore, whereas if you went to Seychelles or if you went to Tanzania, there were dead people. But not Kenya. They had gotten to everyone and got them all off the beach, and that was really early in the morning. And serendipity works. Which skill sets are critical? You've got to have the locals involved because they have local knowledge, but you also have a lot of very site-specific things. If reefs are critical to what you're doing, it's a different approach to reef protection than it is to than protecting mangroves or than protecting shore-built structures. The whole idea is, and I've got Marianne's building codes in here. You got decent building codes, it helps a lot. But if you can stop them from building right on the beach, building beyond the seawall, and if you have a seawall that is fortified, this one's in Valparaiso, Vina del Mar, Chile. They keep making it stronger and stronger as they encounter stronger problems. Okay. And you also don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. If the climate changes enough that you no longer have the whales in Sitka, you lose an awful lot of your industry, your tourism industry, your fishery, and so on. There are a lot of general approaches to anticipate and prevent, but they are all specific to specific places, to specific people. And you do them because they make sense to you. And that then leads us to the last minute or so, where we decided that it might not be a bad idea to give some help to Canadians on what it really means for yourself, to make sure that you have anticipated the kinds of issues you might run into and can act to work to prevent them, to diminish damage to you, your kids, your community. And I think all of you, I hope, have seen this, and if you haven't, it's on our website. But it was designed specifically to be a decision support tool to real people, dealing with their own house, dealing with their own property, dealing with their own community. It's an adaptation guidebook. It shows the kinds of things that you might want to think about preventing. It looks really at what services and things are there to help you, and what are you going to try and do to make sure that you haven't done something stupid, like build again on the same floodplain that flooded last year. It talks about more extremes, extreme colds, November days that are minus 20. I know I didn't anticipate and prevent that, so a lot of my bulbs that I should have taken out are still there until spring. You got to figure out what you're going to do without power supply. If you have something that's fragile, I own a generator, mainly to keep my tropical fish alive, because everything else can probably withstand a while. You've got to look at what should be in your survival kit, what you should have packed in case you have to run because a wildfire comes up or a flood comes up the street. And it looks at some of the health risk things that you might want to think about. I got people with West Nile on my street up in Lanark and the cottage now. And that never used to happen. So again, anticipating, understanding the changing circumstances, and getting my dog a shot is part of my adaptation strategy. So some other things that are in our guidebook, more detail on all of these. Hardening your property, doing your landscape so that it doesn't slope towards your basement. That is one of the worst ones. So many people don't do that. Working within your actual community to make sure that you know who to go to and that they have something. If I call them up and say, who do I call? There's this huge tree about to fall on my house. Who do I call? Demand your local government has an adaptation plan so that the day we get a 2-foot rainfall here, do they have anything in mind for that? They've spent a lot of time, I think, thinking of adaptation plans for the transit system just in case they get a snowfall. How well is that going to work? Okay, so we're ending by saying this is a small building block to help people think about the right stuff for themselves, their own home, their own family. It's published now online. We're sharing it. We're sending it through the Club of Rome to other countries. We have told them to steal it, change it. Just don't take it wholesale. Take it and change it so that when it says Call Environment Canada, it should say Call Environment Australia. At least make enough changes so that the things that are your priority. But it's pretty generic. At least can be used as a generic base for that. And this is really the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome's contribution to helping people understand how to adapt. And we want you to steal it, share it, give it to anybody who will help, and try and find other organizations who want to use it. And if they want to change it and use it, that's fine. We're not after money, credit, or anything else. We just want to save the planet, one house at a time. Thank you very much.